Market system development in post-conflict environment. Does it work? Does it provide opportunities that that we have not fully explored? This is today's discussion with an MSD practitioner. He has worked in post-conflict environment and is about to enlighten us on how to implement market system development in a post-conflict environment. Hello and welcome to Dev TV. At Dev TV, we profile ideas, innovations, and individuals doing incredible stuff in economic development. And today is a special day because we're talking to somebody that has a particular interest in post-conflict environment. He has over 10 years of implementing market system development approach in different settings, but he has decided that post-conflict environment is one of his specialties, and this is where his primary focus has been in the last 5 or 6 years. He started his career in development as a research officer. He then moved on to become a business development coordinator, and then moved on to be a regional coordinator, value chain advisor, a market section manager. His first degree is in agricultural economics and extension. His master's degree is in entrepreneurship and business development, and is currently doing a PhD in business administration. Amazing. Please welcome Mr. Yusuf Jida. Hello,
Hi.
Mr. Yusuf.
Hi, Alabu. How are you doing?
I'm very well. I'm very well. How is it going?
Well, very well. And I must thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts regarding some of our work, in post-conflict environment. I think it's very important because we're having more and more of those kind of contexts. So sharing some thoughts on what we have done, I think will be helpful.
Thank you very much for coming on. As you rightly said, on this channel, what we've been doing is trying to see how we can use market system development approach and bring different elements into market system development as an approach, so we can actually do it better and have a bit more impact. But just before we carry on to discuss post-conflict environment, in your experience as a market system development practitioner, what are the things that has caused you frustration as a practitioner? So not necessarily in the post-conflict environment, but generally, what are those things that really caused you frustration, be it from the donor, from the implementing company, from the partners, from the beneficiaries?
Well, I think first of all, market system development has to be designed and implemented, through partners. I think what can be frustrating is trying to make the partner see the opportunity, because you're trying to make a partner work, in a place where it may be high risk, where returns can take a longer period of time. So I think trying to make the partner to see the long-term opportunities and benefit from your engagement can also be frustrating, especially when you compare that with the life cycle of projects where you don't have all the time in the world to make sure that you actually achieve goals and results. So I think that's different components of designing interventions can be very frustrating, where you have a time frame where you need to deliver. At the same time, you need to engage with an implementing partner to see an opportunity, which may take a lot of time. I think that can be very, very frustrating. And another frustrating challenge you can face is when you're working in a market where there is no proper infrastructure. There's a lot of weaknesses within market systems that you need to address, and especially in developing economies. So that is also very frustrating. You have to sometimes demonstrate that an opportunity exists. So you have to do a lot of things to make sure that bring partners on board. So that can be also very frustrating, especially when you're doing MSD in developing economies.
So, I mean, is this a general difficulty? Do you think this applies to whether post-conflict environment, whether it's a peri-urban environment, whether it's just a particular sector in an urban environment or a rural area? Is it the partnership getting them to a point where they see the value of what you're bringing to them and be able to implement this within the time that the project has to implement? Is it a real thing, or do you think there's a peculiarity to post-conflict environment? Although I don't want to start talking about that till a bit later.
Yeah, I think every context have their own peculiarities. I think the peculiarities in tin markets, like I said, is when you have poor infrastructure, right? However, that is aggravated in a post-conflict environment where you have very poor interests of the private sector to participate within that context, because nobody wants to do business where there is high risk, where a tendency of, attack and insecurity, So that in itself is aggravating the existing problem, So I think that's every context would have its own peculiarity.
Okay, so now if we're to drill down on the differences between implementing a market system within a post-conflict environment and a non-conflict environment, what would you say is the difference? I know you've done both. What would you say is the primary difference as the practitioner between those two environments?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, first of all, a post-conflict environment have its own characteristic. I think, like I said, one of the problems in the post-conflict environment is that there is high risk. So you find very very low presence of the private sector because they don't want to operate in that kind of context. I think another difference is that you have a lot of activities of INGOs and the government. So the role of the private sector has been taken over by INGOs and sometimes the government. So that is also a key difference between these two different contexts. Again, in a post-conflict environment, you have people are very mobile. People are looking for safe haven to stay. So you can start a business or you can start an intervention, and before you know, people were actually, strangers in that context, and then they moved to their communities when security has improved. So that is also another peculiarity, to a post-conflict, environment. And the same, you can also find a lot of mixed skills. Now, in a post-conflict context, you can find people coming from different communities with different skills. So when you want to design intervention, you have to do a proper assessment to understand what existing skills exist, so that you can actually build on that. Because people are coming with certain experience, they are coming with certain skills, So you need to the fastest way to improve their lives or develop an intervention is to ensure that you build on their existing skills.
So that's peculiar. So I mean, let me see if I got this right. So first of all, in a post-conflict environment, because obviously there's just been a conflict, so private sector has been effectively pushed out because of the high risk of the environment, and the role that they play has been taken over mostly by government initiatives and international NGOs. Now, so now as an implementer of a market system driven project, which is essentially relying on private sector, what then do you do? I mean, because as a business person, you weigh opportunity cost, don't you? I mean, you weigh the opportunity that a post-conflict environment presents against the risk, loss of life, loss of property, and even the fact that people may not be as financially buoyant in those sort of environments. What are the things that you do to bring private sector into such an environment?
Well, that's an interesting question because, like you said, you have to implement your interventions through the private sector. I think one of the things that you can do is to help cover that risk. Now, that can actually create some interest from the private sector when you have, cover their risk in terms of insurance or whatever, form that is most convenient. You can cover that risks and make sure, they put their boots on ground to begin to do business. Now, when that happens, there's a tendency for them to keep on doing that, when they begin to see the benefits of doing business in that, because there are also business opportunities within that context. So that's one thing you can do. I think another thing you can do is to also ensure that you do some assessment, because there are businesses that exist within this context. You find business people that may not be as organized as multinationals or bigger companies, that were outside that context. But there are people that have done business for a very long time. They have a stake by staying around those kind of environments. So those people will not leave anyway. So what you can do is also, engage with them and find out what kind of support they need, to spread out their businesses, to make them a bit more stable to engage. So that is ideally some of the things that you can do. You can also kind of work with INGOs, because they also have resources. They're also designing interventions, they're implementing interventions. What you can do is to work with them to ensure that their approaches are a bit more sustainable. So for instance, you can look at voucher schemes instead of distribution of inputs. You can look at voucher schemes where you are engaging retailers, within that context to work with INGOs. They get contracts to supply. So by doing that, you are actually developing business transactions and engagement between retailers within that context and beneficiaries of INGOs. So you have to be very innovative, to look at what exists and how can you build on what exists to begin to ensure that the private sector and private enterprises are beginning to function again.
So perhaps you can give us a sort of like a brief description of a sort of like a post-conflict environment. So the way I think about this, I've never worked in a post-conflict environment, is that people have lost a lot of properties, a lot of loss of life. Sometimes they live in probably camps, and presumably they don't have sort of like an income generating venture that they're doing, mostly being supported by international NGOs. So for a private sector, for you to bring a partner in, I can understand that the partner will serve the INGO, but then because you want it sustainable and scalable, how do you then connect this private sector to then begin to work with the beneficiaries, people that are actually coming out of a conflict? How do you do that?
So first of all, like you said, you are describing a post-conflict, context. You find out that there are people that are living within camps where it's almost impossible for people to stay in their homes. You also have situation where people have moved to other communities that are a bit more stable and a bit more secure. So what you find there, you find a host community with IDPs coming to stay with them, right? So which means in that kind of community, you find a lot of pressure on the resources of that community. So maybe population must have doubled with same farmland, for instance, with the same business opportunities, maybe even less business opportunities, because now there's conflict. So so there's a lot of competition, with the meager resources that exist and opportunities that exist within that kind of context. So that is another kind of scenario that you can find. You can also find communities where there was conflict and maybe insurgents have moved on. What you find in those kind of communities is that you find a lot of female-headed households. It's either their husbands were affected in one way or the other, or their kids, the boys, are affected in one way or the other, because they are the ones that are the easy target, for insurgents. So I mean, these are ideally the kind of three scenarios you can find where the crises have moved on, but there's a lot of female-headed households. Women are stepping into roles that men ideally will play. You also find a context where there is a lot of people living in IDP camps, and then you also find a context where people have moved to host communities, and then there's a lot of pressure, within the meager resources and opportunities in that kind of communities. So that is the scenario. Now, coming back to your question on how you can connect, the private sector with opportunities or with INGOs, within that context. First of all, I think you need to look at the primary enterprise within those kind of contexts. Ideally, mostly is around agriculture farming, either poultry farming, livestock, or crop production. I mean, ideally, these are the similar opportunities you find. In addition to that, you also find people with skills, for vocational skills, right? So people may have that kind of capacity of already been trained before, vocational skills, also living within this kind of context. So ideally, these are the immediate things that we have seen over time, the immediate opportunities we have seen, crafts and all of that. Now, one way you can connect the private sector with all of this is to find a way of assessing the role of the private sector within the intervention, design, and implementation of INGOs. So, for instance, there will be supplies of either inputs, or there will be opportunities for offtake for excess, crops being produced by beneficiaries of INGOs. That's another way to connect, so that you ensure that the private sector are actively involved in either the supply of offtake of commodities within that kind of context. That's an opportunity. There's also a lot of INGOs that also engage in conditional and unconditional cash transfer. So there's an opportunity to link, financial institutions, or fintech companies to be able to provide those kind of services, so that even when these INGOs move on, these fintech companies have customers, that they can engage with, and that can continue even after the intervention. That's the immediate, opportunity. But like I said, you can also try to connect with these, SMEs that are trying to, begin to function again, or you can also try to connect, with farmers, either in livestock or crop production that want to also begin to, start their farming activities again, especially through the supply of inputs. I think in our own experience, one of the earliest interventions we were able to design is input supplier and developing a last mile distribution to ensuring that, the services provided and the commodity and the inputs provided, are fit for purpose. And what do I mean by that? The bulk, you're able to break bulk to make sure that, because disposable income is low, people do not have a lot of finance to engage in the enterprise. So what you need to have appropriate products that will suit their, resources. So, for instance, when we facilitate access to fertilizer, we ensure that in small packs that we actually, ensure that it reaches the smallholder farmers, because the disposable income is low, so you're able to afford 10 kg fertilizer, 5 kg fertilizer, and also seeds being, also sold and supplied in small pack sizes. So, I mean, the product and the service needs to be appropriate, to their disposable income as well. So these are the things that you also take into consideration when you're designing intervention and trying to link the private sector in that kind of context.
No, I mean, thank you very much. I mean, that's certainly enlightening. But on this channel, what we're trying to do really is to effectively practicalize all of these things. So if we take it for granted that practitioners already know the donut and all of those making market work for the poor principles, what would you say are the steps? I mean, I know you've mentioned some of them just now, but if you were to just headline the steps that a practitioner will face if you're coming into a post-conflict environment for the first time, what are the things that, what are the sort of the step 1, step 2, step 3 that you think will be useful for somebody, an MSD practitioner that's never worked in this sort of environment? What are the things that is not in those market system or making market work for the poor approach that we can learn from your own experience?
That's also a very interesting question, because you can have your skills and you have a lot of knowledge regarding, or you can read a lot regarding in designing intervention in post-conflict environment, but when you get there, things can be very difficult. First of all, you need to understand that the context is very dynamic, it changes very quickly. There's also a potential of relapse, of security. You can start an intervention and things can happen. You can also, run into problems of migration. People who move, you design an intervention, and people who move, from where you think they will be. And also, like I mentioned earlier, there will be reluctance of the private sector, especially large ones, to engage in that kind of context. So I will share maybe some experience so that my thoughts regarding your question. I think first of all you need to do a stakeholder mapping. So when I've worked in team markets in the past, but when we moved into a post conflict context, we had to realize that we may hardly find the private sector engaging within that kind of context. So we had to do a stakeholder mapping to understand who are the key players there, who are the INGOs operating in that kind of context, because that's the kind of organizations you find, because a lot of emergency situations and they are trying to provide emergency support, humanitarian support. So we had to do some context analysis and stakeholder analysis to look at, who are the players, who are the government agencies and government players in that kind of context, and at the same time, who are the INGOs operating in that kind of context. So we did that, initially. And afterwards, we also had to do a lot of studies. We did some gender studies to identify where women are placed, what women are doing before and after the conflict. We also needed to do some market assessment to understand which markets are functional and which ones are going to be the quick wins, in terms of short, medium, and long term. Apart from that, we need to also be engaged in forums. You find a lot of INGO forums, people discuss issues, people try to network and work together. So we have to also be part of those kind of forums and also share the importance of moving from humanitarian support into the more developmental support. Now, one of the interesting things that you find when we begin to engage with those kind of networks is that INGOs also have their project cycle, and when they wrote their proposal, they also had targets and results they have agreed to. So they're also working within a time frame. Now, it's going to take a little of time to make them begin to move away from humanitarian support to more long-term sustainable support. And now, so we had to engage with many INGOs during the design phase of their project, where they're writing proposal, to ensure that, they look at issues around market assessment, evaluation assessment, so that, their approaches, interventions are kind of long-term. So we had to do all of that. I think another challenge that you face is how to also, measure some of the impact that you have created, because of, sometimes it's very difficult to reach out and also assess what you've done. So you need to actually also begin to develop innovative ways of result measurement using technology, relying on resources available within those kind of contexts, and also I'm also trying to extend the interventions that we have implemented in very team markets to that kind of context. At least we have the experience. At least we know the partners that we have worked with, and we know how we need to engage with them, to be able to reach out and also kind of cover their risks so that they can engage within that kind of context. So I think that is very important. Leveraging on the kind of resources that you have, the partnerships and relationships you have built over time to ensure that you cover a bit of their risks, so that I'm talking about the private sector, so that they can engage within that kind of context. So you need to do all those analyses and also realize that there will be an interest of government to also partake and understand the operations of development partners in that kind of context. Because, we also had to look at how we can leverage on state resources in terms of extension agents, opportunities for capacity building, so that we can work together. So after intervention, state governments can run with those kind of initiatives. Capacity will be built within the context of state government. They can also run with those kind of initiatives at the end of intervention implementation. So I think networking is very important, because I think I would say that after engaging with INGOs within that kind of context, we realized that even outside where we have worked, they were also trying to work within these new lessons and to also, ensure that they actually tweak their intervention design and approaches, even in other contexts, to ensure that it's more sustainable. So I think networking is very important. Stakeholder and market assessment is very important. Also, leveraging on existing opportunities within those contexts. You don't always have to bring something new. You need to just look at what has been existing, build on that. Where components within value chains are no more functional, you strengthen them to ensure that they begin to function again. I think at some point we realized that we needed to focus on a few things. The first one is capacity building, to look at how do we work with both governments and organizations, with also the private sector within this kind of context, to ensure that they have the necessary skills to design long-term interventions. I think we realized that was very important. Secondly, we thought that commodity aggregation and offtake was very important. So people are being supported when they produce a bit of surplus. They need to sell it somewhere, and markets are distorted. So we needed to develop initiatives around aggregation and offtake of commodities and agricultural inputs. I think thirdly, is also begin to work with beneficiaries and communities to develop cooperatives, so that people begin to share ideas, work together, and by that they're able to leverage in accessing finance and opportunities, from both the private sector, government, and NGOs.
Thank you very much. So one of the things that seems so very special about post-conflict environment is that first of all, you have a particular community that has had an influx of people running away from conflict. Yes. So that creates, obviously, as you mentioned earlier, that creates a lot of tension for the little resources that there is. Now, as an MSD practitioner, do you get involved in sort of like potential community conflict between the host community and the people coming in? And how much of that causes you problem implementing a market system type approach in that sort of environment?
Well, there's a tendency to run into conflict because you may likely find yourself doing, if you don't do a proper assessment, is to only engage with the IDPs that are coming to those communities. Now, while the host community needs to share their farmland as well, so you can run into conflict, and you find out that the IDPs have their own network, and host communities also have their own networks. So if you don't do a proper assessment and understand that kind of context, you may likely run into problems where you're focusing only on one group. Now, I think what we have been able to do is to take time to understand these dynamics within this kind of communities. And you can get that through community leaders. They will tell you, okay, these are the number of IDPs that we have, this is what they've been doing, this is what their capacities are from our engagement with them and all that. So you need to have a holistic approach where, you develop interventions both for host communities and for IDPs, and try to engage both groups in your interventions, because if you don't do that, you may likely run into problems. So I think if you're working within that kind of context, you need to have some skills for peace building as well, and engagement, because what you can do also is to see how enterprise and market system approaches can actually resolve conflict as well, because it's possible when people are making money, people are engaged doing their businesses, there is a very low tendency that you participate in insurgency. So you need to have that kind of skill as well,
Wow, thank you very much. That's amazing. So not only do you have to have the technical knowledge of market system development as an approach, you have to have influencing skills of bringing in NGOs, bringing in government, bringing in private sector, and you then have to have a peace building skill where you're bringing two communities together, the host community and the visiting community, to try and work out roles for each of them so they can get along properly. At the same time, you have to have a transactional skill where you're negotiating relationships between these two communities, commercial relationships. I think that's amazing. And listen, we've taken a lot of your time today. Thank you very much for this. I think this is certainly an educational session for us because I have never worked in a post-conflict environment, and you certainly have given me a lot of insight to think about, and I'm sure some of our audience will be glad that you came on to talk to us about post-conflict environments. So thank you very much, Mr. Yusuf Jida. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I think so maybe some parting words. Wherever there are challenges, there's also opportunities, right? I think working in post-conflict, environment and context has made me understand that there could be some quick opportunities, of impact that can be left, operating that kind of context. I think the first one is that you realize that you're developing innovative financial tech solutions for rural communities, and this is very important, and this can have lasting impact within those kind of contexts. You also find that there is synergy created within development actors, and models can be developed and adopted in other contexts. So INGOs collaborating with one another, INGOs, development partners collaborating with governments, so that kind of context will force you to collaborate, and then you begin to share knowledge and lessons which you can carry to other contexts and other experiences. I think what I also say that you find yourself strengthening vocational skill systems, which can have long-lasting, impact on those kind of contexts as well. And also developing local enterprise, solution for local enterprise, because that is what you have to do. You find yourself developing those kind of, systems, and that can have also lasting solutions and impact in that kind of context. But thank you very much for having me, Elabib.
No, thank you very much. I mean, that was an important addition that you did just then. I was just mindful of the time. That's why I wanted to collapse it and then plead with you that you must come back some other time to talk to us specifically about a particular project that you've done and how you've created all of this incredible opportunities for businesses to operate. I'm not sure how possible this is for you to share some of the things that you're doing privately or you're doing with the people that you're working with. I'm not sure how appropriate that is. Is there anything that you might want to share with us in case anybody wants to reach you? I know they can reach you on LinkedIn. Is there anything that you might want to share that you think our audience will be useful for our audience to know?
Well, I'll just say that we need to. Unfortunately, we are finding ourselves in more or less, of a conflict context. Where you find, if it's not insurgency, you find farmer herders clashes. Ethnic crisis. So there's a lot of context of this nature emerging, and so we need to projects, philanthropists and foundations need to begin to look at solutions and models that can be designed and implemented in this kind of context. What I would say is that we're doing a lot of work, both privately, and then as a firm. So maybe what I will do is that in my next opportunity, I will talk about specific things that we have done, a specific intervention that we're able to design, implement, and what the impact has been and what the lessons are. So I think I would take up one intervention under one market and also share that experience and also give some feedback regarding some of our lessons, and so that others can also learn from it.
Fantastic. I would definitely take you up on that. Thank you very much, because that's what we want to try and do here, to share experiences, to share some of the knowledge that you have accumulated over the years in your particular experience. And so some of us that have never been in that experience can learn from it. So thank you very much once again. Thank you for coming on DEF TV. And And I'm sure people may want to reach out. People working in those sort of contexts may want to reach out. They can find you on LinkedIn, Yusuf Jida, and this is going live on LinkedIn as well. So I'm sure they can reach you if they so wish. If anybody wants to reach Yusuf Jida, you can also send me a message, and I shall definitely pass it on. So thank you very much, Mr. Yusuf, and this has been really educational. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
There you have it, Dev TV. Mr. Yusuf has just given us incredible insight into what happens within a post-conflict environment, what happens within an MSD project in a post-conflict environment. I hope you've learned as much as I have, and please join us the next time we speak to an MSD practitioner. Thank you for watching.